Okay, I've already started recording this 7 or 8 times, and then I stop because I keep tripping over the beginning. You know, the funny thing is, the first line of a short story, or a novel for that matter, is considered to be one of the most important lines. The opening scene is considered to be one of the most important scenes because that's what draws the reader in and gets them to settle in for a while you tell them a tale that hopefully they find worth telling. Also, or worth reading in their case, but also when you get to the end, if you as the author are able to stick the landing, the audience is willing to forgive if there were some rough patches in the middle of the story. And if you totally blow the ending and just do a terrible job of it, then sometimes people will just say, well, they will think to themselves, it wasn't worth reading in the first place, even if it was actually great up until that point. But I contend the middle is very, very, very important. Stephen King, I think, has built his entire career off of the juicy middle. He sometimes is amazing at setting the hook, either with an amazing first sentence or a very compelling first scene. However, some of his novels, maybe not so much. Sometimes he is really able to stick the landing. I would say a third of his novels and maybe even more of his short stories, he manages to really stick the landing in such a way that it is so satisfying. You just have to bask in the glow of it for a while when you're done reading, just to let it all soak in. And a third of his endings, not so good at all. I would say a third of his endings are actually kind of not satisfying. And even so, that doesn't stop me from reading his next novel, because really what the important part, I think, for him is the juicy middle, where he is able to not just weave a story with plot and plot points, but with character and setting and textures and nuances and subtext. And that is why his writing is so compelling. And that's why so many of his stories become bestsellers, even when they may not end perfectly, as some of his other novels may or may not end. And this is very much on my mind because today I want to tell you a couple of stories about my good friend, the late author John Pitts, or J.A. Pitts, which was his nom de plume. And I'm also going to tell you a story of a couple of other people who contribute to this one, mostly because they're not around anymore. But that's all going to make sense in a minute. Welcome to the Endless Files, thoughts on pop culture, history, and the human condition from a very specific Generation X point of view. So, before I tell you about John Pitts, I want to tell you about Dr. Henry Tooney. He was a professor who was older than dirt. He was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, where I had been where I was in grad school, and he taught political science. And he had a very unique style. Now, he taught only graduate level courses. He did not teach undergrads, and it was probably just as well because they wouldn't be able to understand a single word he said. We, the grad students who took classes with him, could barely understand anything that he said. He had a very soft-spoken manner about him, and I don't mean he mumbled. It was more along the lines of his voice projected just fine, but it was not always quite clear what he was saying. Even if you could hear the words didn't always make sense in context, until every once in a while he would say something and then it would all of a sudden illuminate everything he had been saying up until that point. And you would get these glimpses of genius, and it was captivating. He also had some very interesting idiosyncrasies because he was a man who was in his advanced years. He would frequently go off into tangents. I'm sure some of you have noticed I am capable of doing this from time to time as well. But he would go off onto tangents, and he would mention in a casual, offhand manner some person by name, as if you would know who he's talking about. And if that person was no longer with us, he would always add as an additional aside, he's dead now, poor bastard. And then he would continue to tell you this amazing thing that this amazing person had told him. Except we never knew the names. We never recognized the names of the people he was talking about. You know, it would be one thing if he said, well, you know, I was having lunch with Socrates this one time. He's dead now, poor bastard. And you know, and it was funny too, because he said to me when we were done, he said, I drank what? Except Dr. Tooney didn't say things that were by people who we had ever heard of. I mean, I would believe it if he said he had had lunch with Socrates. I mean, the guy really projected age. But he would say things that sometimes they wouldn't quite land, but then sometimes they would. And after a few beats, you're like, oh, Socrates said I drank what? Because the way he died was, and you kind of get the picture. And by the way, if you don't know how Socrates died, you're not getting the picture, which was the same thing about Dr. Henry Tooney. He would say things that were so incredible. He would pose questions. Why is it in 1930 the United States and Argentina were almost equal in terms of wealth, gold reserves, military power, and all of the rest of this, and then the United States goes on to become the absolute superpower of the West, while Argentina fades into the background, even though they both started from this very, very strong point. By the way, this was a question he actually asked, and I don't remember what the answer was, but it was probably something it was probably something as out of left field as, well, I mean, you're not figuring it out? I mean, obviously it was because of the movie industry, or obviously it was because of the invention of the automobile, or whatever. I don't remember. I do remember him talking about the future of cities, why some cities are going to be the powerhouse cities of the future. And this was one of those cases where when he said it, as soon as he said it, I realized all of the deep thinking that was going on behind those eyes. When he was challenging us to say which cities were going to become powerhouses, and he named off a few, and we're kind of like, I don't know, because of the way their government is organized. No. It's not about their government. It's because they are burying miles and miles and miles of fiber optic cable along their roads and highways. And the fiber optic cabling is absolutely going to be what launches these cities ahead of any other city that isn't doing that right now. This was the early 1990s when he said this, and of course, fiber optic cable has become an essential part of the internet as the backbone upon which the world's economy rests. The guy was brilliant, but as I say, he also had this way of these mannerisms that were just absolutely astounding. And especially his ability to mention names as if they were the most important people in their field, and then just toss off with a casual, he's dead now, poor bastard, and then continue with whatever his line of thinking was. And it was It was an amazing thing to behold. None of his classes ever had more than a handful of people in them at any given time. When I took a class with him, I was one of two. When most of my friends who were in the same cohort as I was moving through the graduate program, uh, a couple of them had taken a class with him, and I think their class had a total of 7 students. I kind of envied them because when there were only 2 of us and then the other person kept not showing up, it was like all of this attention was being beamed on me, and I have to admit he was either the most brilliant man or the most discombobulated man I had ever had the pleasure of meeting. And it was a couple decades later when I was living in the Seattle area when I happened to read on the internet this news article that had made the national news as one of those curiosities. University professor dies and no one notices. Totally misleading headline, but very captivating, and it was about University of Pennsylvania professor Dr. Henry Tooney. Apparently had died earlier that summer, and nobody told the students that he wasn't going to be showing up, but his class was still on the syllabus, or syllabus, wrong word. Anyway, the class was not canceled. So the students showed up for the class, and he wasn't there, and nobody told them that he was dead, and they didn't find out until the second time they showed up for class. I believe I'm remembering the news article correctly. Nonetheless, when I saw this, it was presented as sort of a humorous. The university didn't tell the students, so they kind of sat around waiting. I don't even know how this made it into the news. Did one of them mention it to someone at the university paper, the Pennsylvanian, and then that got picked up by the Associated Press, and then that got carried by the major newspapers online? I have no idea how, but nonetheless, students showing up for a class that didn't happen, this becomes a thing. And it became a thing because I noticed it, and I had to text 2 very dear friends of mine with whom I was still in contact. Did you guys hear that Dr. Henry Tooney is dead now? Poor bastard. There's really no other way to announce his passing. I tell you that because this was a story that I had also told to my friend John. Now, I believe I've mentioned in a couple of other videos here, I had the pleasure of taking a 6-week intensive science fiction writing workshop some time ago. And my then wife had actually taken the exact same workshop the year before. And so when she had taken the workshop, she got invited to, there were weekly parties that were held for the students of this workshop. And because the workshop happened to be held in the same city where we were living, even though she was living in the dorms with the other people in the workshop, she would invite me and I would join for the parties that they had on Friday nights. And it was really kind of cool, the people you would meet at these parties. First of all, you would meet the instructors, and you would meet the people who were recent alumni, and you would meet people who were older alumni who were enjoying writing careers. And you learned a lot about science fiction and fantasy publishing by listening to people's stories about what they were writing, when they were writing, how they got their agents, their editors, their book deals, or their self-publishing, or whatever happened to be the deal at the time. And you also met people who were just plain active in the local science fiction and fantasy writing community in general. People who didn't necessarily have any direct connection to the workshop, but who were traveling in the same sphere, and so they would naturally end up with invitations and show up as well. And this is where I met John. John Pitts was very active in the science fiction writing community. He hadn't sold any of his own writing yet, but he had a couple of very dear friends of his who were trying to break in. He was trying to break into the publishing game. And once he had found out about Clarion West and he got more and more involved with it, he began to volunteer for the organization. And as a result, he knew who was who, and he was, as I say, as a volunteer, he was very supportive of the people who were just coming in. And he and I ended up having a couple of wonderful conversations. And then one of the things also that came out when my then wife took the workshop was that it is also well advised, if you are a writer of a particular genre, to show up to that genre's conventions. If there's a romance convention or a mystery convention and you write romance or you write mystery, well then go, especially if it's local, or if it's not local, if it is reasonably known, well attended, that kind of thing. There are a lot of local and regional science fiction and fantasy conventions in the Pacific Northwest, where Seattle and Portland are, and these are the two main locations where those conventions tend to be held. And the thing about the conventions is they're not necessarily purely writers' conventions, but they almost always have a writer's track where they will have panels featuring writers who will talk about writing or the industry or whatever the case may be. And members of the audience may be fans of those authors. They may be fans of the genre in general, or they may be other writers, both early in their careers and even further into their careers. So by attending these conventions, or what are still called cons, by attending these cons, you get to know other people at your level or coming up behind you, or people who are a few steps ahead of you. You even get to meet some of the great names. It was amazing to encounter such fantastic writers who were so well known. Robert Silverberg is a name that leaps to mind, but Nancy Kress, she was incredible. There were several authors who made the rounds for these conventions, including a couple of my favorites who I am sure I will be talking about from time to time. Connie Willis, head and shoulders above many of them. Connie Willis, by the way, one of the most decorated authors in science fiction, and yet when I talk to people who don't read science fiction, they've never heard her name. They've heard the name Robert A. Heinlein, or they've heard Arthur C. Clarke, or many of the others. But Connie Willis's writing is so good, and you do not have to be an aficionado of science fiction to appreciate her writing. So consider that a plug. If you ever get a chance to read some Connie Willis and you haven't yet, you should. Anyway, Nancy Kress, also very brilliant writer. So you meet these people. Well, you also end up encountering some people repeatedly and start to build relationships with them. And that is what had happened with me and John Pitts. John and I just clicked. We had a very similar sensibility, a similarly compatible, quirky sense of humor. And also, we could talk deeply about politics and other topics in the social sciences, in the hard sciences. We were both well read and could compare notes on our favorites. We both were very much into the movies. We were both very much into music. Obviously, we never ran out of things to talk about. And so he and I would frequently end up talking together, especially when my then wife would spend time with her classmates from the workshop or other people she had met through the workshop. So she'd be off doing her thing, and then I'd be off doing my thing, and I'd bump into John, and we got along great. Well, John lived within reasonably close proximity to where my wife and I lived. And so we started spending time with him and his wife, and we would play card games and that kind of thing. The sort of things that I remember my parents doing. And I'm sure it occurred to me more than once, this feels so grown up going to play cards with another couple. Um, and what was also interesting was that his wife grew up in the same town that I did. So even though we certainly had not met each other when we were both living there. I mean, it was a fairly large city, but even so, we had a lot of common reference points that we could make, and very similar sensibilities when it came to coming from that corner of the country. And I would say that this friendship persisted for about 10 years when something changed. The whole country had gone through an economic calamity, and the business that I was running at the time started to fall on hard times, and I had to start finding gainful employment working for somebody else because my business was not going to be paying the mortgage. And I would mention it to anybody who I was talking to. In fact, this is excellent career advice. No matter what century you are hearing this in, you are more likely to find employment through somebody you know, or somebody you know who knows somebody, than you are to find it through the newspaper classifieds or the online job boards or however jobs are advertised at the time that you happen to be listening to my story. Talk to people. Let people know that you are available and that you are looking for work and that you are skilled, and you never know what's going to come of it. I cannot remember the number of times I would say John and I would get together for lunch every couple of weeks. He had a job working for one of the largest employers in the Pacific Northwest. And so as a result, at this particular phase of our lives, it was easiest to get together during a lunch break and meet somewhere that was relatively close to where he worked, so that he didn't have to take a ton of time off. But he made sure that we continued to have these lunches, and even though we were no longer doing the card games at night at this particular phase in our lives, and I was my wife and I had started raising kids, and kids can be a little bit of a distraction. In terms of your nighttime activities, you don't go out as much. You're at home taking care of the kids. And so, but nonetheless, John made sure we continued to get together at least every couple of weeks, have lunch. And this was something he did with a lot of his friends. This was something that became obvious to me later, was that there were friends that were in his mental Rolodex who he would occasionally just think to himself, I haven't seen this person in a couple of months. And then he would reach out to that person and say, hey, we should get together and keep the connection alive. And that was just something he did. And he did it with me. And I cannot remember the number of times I said to him, oh, by the way, the business is having kind of a rough time right now. And if you become aware of any job openings that are coming up, inevitably we would talk about some of my skill sets. And by the way, these didn't dominate our conversations. These little side trips into, oh, by the way, still looking for work. But when we would talk about things that we had done on the job at one employer or another, I would inevitably mention that I had been doing database work for this company or that company or whatever. Now, I've done a lot of other kinds of work as well, but on one occasion he said, "You do database work, don't you? Or you have?" And I'm thinking to myself, I think I've probably only mentioned that about 80 times, but yes, I still, for all I know, he might have been being sarcastic, being, sort of playing it a little silly. But anyway, regardless, whether he didn't actually remember or he did remember, he said, do you do database work? Because my team needs another programmer, and maybe I can get your resume on the right desk. And this is why I mention it when I am looking for work to whoever will listen, because this is how opportunities present themselves. So he got my resume on the right desk, and really just because of his say-so, his manager was happy to hire me on as a contractor. Now, when I was hired on, both he and the manager used the term the Dread Pirate Roberts contract. The Dread Pirate Roberts, if you're not familiar, is a character from a movie called The Princess Bride. And it's actually a book, too, written by William Goldman. I've read the book. It's a great book. Highly recommend it. And the movie is amazing. The movie is one of the most quotable movies you have ever seen. The screenplay was also written by William Goldman. Wouldn't it be funny if I'm misremembering his last name right now? I'll have to look that up, and if it's wrong, mention it in the comments. Anyway, I'm not always good with names, is the thing. But the Dread Pirate Roberts took on an apprentice, and then every night, at the end of the day, he would say, "Good night, Wesley. You did a great job. I'll like as not kill you in the morning." That was Dread Pirate Roberts. And so I was on the Dread Pirate Roberts contract, which meant could be any given day, everything's going great, but they could just as likely end my contract the next day. So I understood that this was a temporary gig. It wasn't really, all I had to do was do the job. And as long as I did the job, they were going to have me for a while because they had a lot of work that had to be done. They were very understaffed. In fact, they were so understaffed that for the first several years that I ended up on this team, I was working overtime whenever I wanted, which pays time and a half. I would work on weekends and get paid time and a half. And so I made up for the shortfall of my business not doing so well during this the Great Recession. And the salary was not salary, salary. The hourly rate was very good because essentially my friend John said, when they were talking about, well, he'll probably accept this as a salary, he said, "You should pay him the same rate you're paying me," which he didn't have to do. And his management was correct. I would have accepted something that paid less, but he presented it as, this is what you should do. His management took it as, okay, then this is what we will do. And so they hired me at the same rate that he had been working at, and he had been working there for years. I mean, I had years of experience, but not there. So what I'm saying is, he was a very generous individual. But when you take a job with somebody where you are going to be working with a person you know very well, you should always be concerned about not tripping up your friendship. Or maybe you should not be concerned about, or you should be concerned about not letting your friendship trip up your employment. However you choose to evaluate which is more important. But it takes effort to make sure you thread the needle so that you can do well in the job and hold on to your friendship. And John and I managed to pull that trick off. And I was exceedingly happy about that. Now, I did make sure that I was doing well on the job at the outset just because I knew that John had put himself on the line by recommending me to come on board in the first place. So I felt like I owed it to him. And he was, even though he wasn't my manager, he was nominally my lead. It was his project. And so my tasks were really at his discretion. And so I did everything I could to make sure that he was pleased, that our manager was pleased, and that at the time when we were building tools that were being used by other people in the company. And when you're building tools for other people in the company, even though they are your coworkers, you don't call them coworkers, you call them customers, or at least at the time that was the tradition. I know that changed a few years later, but anyway, I made sure the customers were happy, the internal customers. And it worked out great. And in fact, he and I ended up having cubicles next to each other for, I don't know, 5 or 6 years. Things started to slow down for me at that employer. They started scaling back on allowing people to work overtime, and so overtime didn't happen anymore. And then for one reason or another, it looked like they were going to actually cut my position. And I volunteered to them. I said, hey, it looks like right at the moment you don't have as much work for me as you have had in the past, but you do still need me. I am happy to work fewer hours, and then I will use the other hours to do some other freelance work on the side. And they were happy with that arrangement. So they were paying me less to do the stuff they still needed me to do. And then I was free to try to start up another business. In the end, they needed me more again, and the other business wasn't ramping up as quickly, and so I ended up back in the fold. And what had happened here was John had moved from one position to another where they had a lot more need for a lot more work, and he created a new project there. And when he said, I need more people on the team, when they finally said, okay, you can hire somebody else, he said, hey, you want to come over and join my team? And I was very, very happy to do so. So I moved back into an organization where he was my lead. And then my commute expanded from 20 minutes to an hour because we were now working in a different facility that was fighting rush hour traffic both ways every time. And it was a longer distance and all the rest of that. But we shared an office. This time, instead of having 2 cubicles that were in the same pod, we actually took a largish conference room, and then we permanently reserved it and turned it into an office that could hold 2 or 3 people. It's not like it was super large, but it was large enough to hold 2 or 3 people with desks, with whiteboards, and we could all face each other. We didn't have to all have our desks up against the wall the way, we had our backs to each other when we were in our respective cubicles. We managed to work together, John and I, for 10 years as coworkers, sharing an office or sharing a cubicle space. And even so, we would occasionally go out for lunch or dinner as circumstances would allow, as just the 2 of us, not as coworkers, but as friends. We would continue to go to cons together. We would go to writing workshops together. And in fact, the 2 of us went to an advanced writers workshop that was held on the coast of Oregon, and we both ended up selling our first stories to a pro publication, to an anthology, at the same time. There was a workshop where the whole idea was how to write to spec. When an editor sends out a call for submissions and says, I am putting together an anthology about taverns in space, and it's going to be called Cosmic Cocktails, and send me your best science fiction tales from bars in outer space. So the workshops were all about how you get a request for submissions like that and then produce a story that is likely to get picked up. And then the culmination of this workshop, and this workshop was held a couple times a year for a few years there in Oregon. It would culminate with a meeting with an editor who actually was looking to fill an anthology that was the one that was described when we were first told and given the writing exercise of write a story that would fit this. Well, there were two two anthologies that we were working on for this one workshop, and I managed to sell to both of them. And he managed to sell to one of them. But this was awesome because this ended up, the one that we both sold to was the first one to get published of the two. The editor had said something fascinating to both him and me. There were a lot of other people in the room who had submitted stories who were a part of this workshop. And the way it worked was, well, we would all have assignments, and we would all have lectures about approaches, how you build a story around these sorts of requirements. And the thing is, I mean, we weren't being taught how to come up with a story. That was something you already had to know how to do by the time you got there. But it was more along the lines of, how do you write a story that will appeal to the editor who has posted the call for submissions? And one of the things to do is, the first idea that you get when you read the call for submissions, don't do that first idea. There was one of these was called Hags, Sirens, and Other Bad Girls of Fantasy. Fantasy as in fantasy and science fiction, not the kind of fantasy you might be thinking of. And, well, this says right in the title, Hags, Sirens, and Other Bad Girls of Fantasy. So if your first thought is probably about the three sisters, the witches from Macbeth, or the sirens from Greek mythology. If that's your first thought, don't write that. In fact, as a general rule, don't write a titled character, which, by the way, is fantastic guidance. I highly recommend it, and I absolutely got away with violating that principle. For the Hags, Sirens, and Other Bad Girls of Fantasy, I wrote about the sirens, and I got away with it. But for this anthology called Swordplay, you were invited to write a story that prominently featured a famous sword. Quick, name a famous sword. Oh, Excalibur. Yeah. Don't write about Excalibur. Probably the editor is going to receive a ton of submissions regarding Excalibur. And the editor is only going to take one story about a given sword. And you can't take a story that you've written about Excalibur and then cross out the word Excalibur and then write in the name of some other sword. That's not going to work. Excalibur is a unique sword that has a unique history that people will understand. So there's only going to be one Excalibur story. Don't compete against everybody else who's writing an Excalibur story. Swordplay. My friend John came up with an idea he was very big in Norse mythology, and he decided the central story was going to be about a sword, and I don't even remember the name of the sword, but Norse mythology is famous for naming swords. And so there was this sword that is famous for having a black blade, and the story was going to center upon somebody who worked as a blacksmith at the Renaissance fairs that happen around the countryside. And on some occasion, somebody brings to her this sword that needs repair, and it's got a black blade and all that, and it's supposed to represent this famous sword, except it is the famous sword, and it has magical properties that correspond with that particular Norse mythology, and it all draws then this character into a grander world where it turns out many of the more Norse gods are still walking among us. Fantastic story. That's what John wrote. I wrote a story about the sword that was carried by not Charlemagne, but one of Charlemagne's lieutenants. Oh, I can't even remember his name right now. It might have been Roland. Anyway, I'm telling you this story, and I can't remember this important detail. The sword was going to factor into a novel that I was writing at the time about not so much time travel, but it was more about you know what? I don't want to give away too much, so I'm not going to give it away. The point is, modern day, couple of people find out where the sword is located. They're going to go find the sword. Much adventure ensues. Those are the two stories that each of us presented for swordplay. Now, as I say, it was a relatively large group that was in this workshop, and the editor was going through and in general would say, okay, here's what worked for me about your story. Oh, so this entire group is all gathered together, and the editor is there. We have all turned in stories the previous day, and the editor has spent a day reading through all of them, making notes on all of them, and saying, okay, here's what worked, here's what didn't, but I'm going to go ahead and buy it if you make those changes and if those changes work. Okay, this worked and this didn't work. I'm not interested in this for this particular anthology, but it's good writing, keep trying again. Here you go. So she bought a few, and then there were a few others she didn't buy. And she got to John and me at different times during this procession, and she said the same thing to each of us, and she didn't say this to anybody else. She said, "This is an excellent first chapter to a novel. I want you to write that novel." But then what she said to John was, "Nonetheless, I think if you make this tweak, and this tweak, this can still stand as a short story. And if you can make those changes, then I'll buy it." What she said to me was, again, this is a great first chapter to a novel. I want you to write that novel. But in the meantime, she did not see a path for turning that into a short story. So what she said to me was, if you are able to get a story to me within whatever the deadline was, which I think was a week, if you can get a story to me within a week or two, then I'll consider that one. But this one, you go turn that one into a novel. Okay. So I had a limited amount of time. Maybe it was a week, maybe it was 2 weeks. Again, the memory doesn't hold up as well after years and years and years. But I figured out what I was going to write about. And I ended up writing about the cavalry sword that is always depicted as being on Custer General George Custer, who was famous for his last battle, which is often referred to as Custer's Last Stand. It's also known as the Battle of Little Bighorn. Took place in Montana. I happen to have driven through this locale on one of my many drives across the country, and I had visited and all that, and I learned all about this battle. The interesting thing is, all of these paintings that you have ever seen of General George Custer, he's carrying this cavalry sword. Usually nobody else is, but he is. The fact of the matter is, on the day that they rode into battle, he ordered his men not to bring their cavalry swords. So why do the paintings show him with a cavalry sword when none of the others brought a cavalry sword into this particular famous battle? That was the starting point for my story. Now, most of the stories that were submitted, the famous swords were actually mythological, folklore, fantastical, magical, whatever. Mine was actually about a real sword, and I wrote what turned out to be my first piece of historical fiction. And the thing is, yeah, I studied as much as I could about what happened, and then as I was writing the story, I began to understand the significance of why the sword was there when he had told everybody not to bring theirs. And by the way, this is a type of writing that's called pantsing. It's writing by the seat of your pants. Up until around this era of my writing career, I had always been a plotter, which means you write out everything that's going to happen in what order, and you know where all the characters are going to be, and then you go. When you're a pantser, you start with your premise, you start with your characters and a setting, and you just go with that. And rather than trying to hit specific plot beats, you follow the characters with your premise in mind. A lot of people think that's crazy. I will note, by the way, Stephen King has only ever plotted one novel in his entire career, and that was The Dead Zone. And if you want to study the difference between pantsing and plotting, read The Dead Zone and then read The Shining. Read any number of his other novels. They're all written by the seat of his pants, but with the exception of The Dead Zone. And yet, when you read them, it's like, this foreshadows that. This was all planned all along. How could this not have been plotted? He writes it once, and then once he realizes where everything is going to go, then he writes it a second time with the salient points all in mind, and the themes and all of the rest of that. But he does write it by the seat of his pants. Then he just does a second draft. So I wrote this story by the seat of my pants, and sold it, and that was fantastic. John rewrote his story about the Black Blade. He didn't rewrite it. He addressed those couple of concerns. Now, keep in mind, in the meantime, we're working together, and over work, during lunch or whatever, it'd be like, yeah, so I'm thinking of doing this with this story. Yeah, I'm thinking about writing about Custer, so we were constantly bouncing ideas off of each other with regard to our writing, as well as with regard to database programming. I'm thinking of maybe using a bridge table instead of blah blah blah. Oh yeah, it was any given time. If you were to swing by our office, the conversations would be on any number of topics that would just confuse the average person. Wait a minute, I thought they were talking about swords. Now they're talking about bridge tables and databases. What's going on here? Anyway, we both sold our stories to this editor. As I mentioned, I had also sold a story to a different anthology as well, and that was nice. And the thing is, John very much enjoyed my success. And I very much enjoyed his success. So when the anthology was published, it was the first, it was his first table of contents. And I can't remember who, see, I can't remember. I think this one was published first, but the more I think about it, the more I think the one about the bars in space was the one that was published first. Doesn't matter. John's first table of contents, I was in that table of contents as well, and authors will refer to that as sharing a table of contents. So we shared a table of contents, and we shared his first table of contents. And there's a certain special feeling that comes from that when your professional writing career starts at the same moment as your friend's professional writing career. Now, we shared that table of contents with some very well-known writers, and we also shared those tables of contents with, because we later got published together in other anthologies, with other people who were at our level, and then all levels in between. By the time John sold his last story, he was a seasoned writer. He was actually he became the focal point of the anthology, and I'll explain why in a minute, but he became the big name as opposed to the newbie, which was just fantastic. And it's all because of Black Blade Blues. When the editor had said, this is a great first chapter to a novel, and I want you to write that novel, he heard, this is a great first chapter to a novel, and I want you to write that novel. So he wrote the novel. I was in the middle of working on another novel, so I tabled the one that I tabled the one that she had said is a great first chapter as, this is a novel I will work on later. He went ahead and wrote the one that, even though he had been in the middle of writing another novel, he put that on the shelf and he started on this one because there was an editor who had expressed interest. Great idea. And it worked really well for him. He finished the novel, and keep in mind, we were going to cons together all the time, and we would talk about, oh, I met such and such an editor. Do you think I should approach this way or that way? You know, should I suggest this or whatever? He literally ended up sharing an elevator ride with an editor at a major publishing house. And you've heard the term elevator pitch. He gave an elevator pitch, a literal elevator pitch about this novel that he had written, The Black Blade Blues. And she's like, you know what? I'm looking for urban fantasy. That sounds great. Why don't you send it to me and mention that we had this conversation? So he did. Didn't hear from her for a while, and then again, when we were at work or over lunch or whatever, he would say, yeah, I haven't heard from her, and I'm not sure when I should prompt her again. And so we would strategize about that. And eventually there was another convention where there was an opportunity for him to talk to her. And she's notoriously slow at reading her pile of submissions. So by prompting her, that encouraged, because again, she brought up she's looking for urban fantasy. So then she looked for his manuscript. She read it. She's like, yes, I want to buy this. And then the publishing house offered him a 3-book deal. This is amazing. Your first book, and it's a 3 or multiple book deal. His was a 3-book deal. Fantastic. The advance wasn't super huge, but it wasn't super tiny, and they were going to publish it as a hardback first and then as mass market, which is great. It shows some faith in what they expect how successful they expect this to be. So when he told me about it, he started off with, I don't know how to tell you this, and I'm expecting bad news. He said, Claire bought the book, and she wants to. She actually gave me a contract for 3, and I was so happy. Now, some people are happy when they see their friends do well, even if their friends are doing well in something that they are also working on. Some people are not. And that's why John was reticent to bring it up with me. Because he said, and I asked him, why would you be hesitant to tell me about this? He said, because I've already told a couple of other people, and they seem to kind of resent it. This is actually not an unusual reaction. If somebody else is also writing and they haven't gotten a contract and you have gotten a contract, they may express some element of envy or some other negative response to sort of justify why they haven't gotten that success yet. I don't know how common this is. But apparently it was common enough for John to where he was careful about how he told people. He did eventually have to tell people because, he was going to have a book coming out. And we talked about whether he should publish it under his name or if he should use initials or a pseudonym. He ended up deciding to use his initials because the main character of the novel, and actually of the series, is a lesbian woman blacksmith, and he wrote that character for that role because he wanted to cast against type. And it also ended up being very much a metaphor about how you come to terms with who you are when who you are is not predefined, not easily put into the slots that society offers you. So he's writing about that with this character, with these traits, and there are 2 schools of thought in fantasy and science fiction when it comes to writing outside of your immediate wheelhouse. One of those thoughts is very inclusive. It's like, yes, write about people who are a different skin color, a different ethnicity, a different gender, a different sexual orientation, a different age. Make a big world, and a big world has a lot of people in it, and you can use these as opportunities to explore how we all interact with each other on a multiple on a multitude of levels. There's another school of thought, and that is, don't you dare write from someone else's point, some other ethnicity's point of view, some other gender's point of view, some other any demographic difference point of view, because that's cultural appropriation, and cultural appropriation is bad. I can and by the way, obviously I have an opinion on this. I completely understand and appreciate the idea that it is disingenuous to take credit for an idea that you have essentially stolen from somewhere else, and if where you stole it from was another culture, well, now you're bad because you are capitalizing on your position of privilege over this other demographic's position that is not as privileged, and you're benefiting from that. You're introducing something new to your demographic, and so as a result, some people view this as cultural appropriation, and it's very, very bad, whereas other people view it as all representation is good representation as long as you don't portray everybody in a given demographic as being a bad person. Tolkien did this. Tolkien wrote about other demographics by making them other species. Okay, these people are orcs. These people are wizards. Gene Roddenberry did this with Star Trek. There's no serious study of Star Trek without acknowledging that the Klingons represent the Russians. or the Soviets of his day. There's and later on when Gene Roddenberry created Star Trek: The Next Generation, there is no denying that different species in that world were clearly meant to be analogs for other known demographics in the world today. And those are excellent topics to delve into, and we can delve into them at a later time. But this was real. This was immediate. This was happening to us. Well, actually, it was happening to John. John's main character was three things he was not: a woman, a lesbian, and a blacksmith. The blacksmiths were probably not going to be upset with him writing a story about blacksmithing. And he had to go spend time with blacksmiths to learn how it works so that he could write credibly about what his characters were doing, let alone all the research he had to do into Norse mythology and all the rest of that. But there were some people who, when they found out what he was writing, they were very concerned that he was not only straying into the land of cultural appropriation, but also potentially hurting the demographic he's writing about, because either he gets it wrong, or he misrepresents in a negative way. Any compelling fiction, your characters are going to have flaws. Now, usually the bad guys, their flaws lead them to be bad, but your good guys still have flaws too. Sometimes these are referred to as anti-heroes if the flaws are big enough. Look at the superheroes like Batman, that kind of thing. But and pardon me if you're already well aware of all of this, but he had to make sure that he got this right. And there were some people who were convinced he couldn't get it right no matter what he did, because he's a dude. And he had it read by people who fit within different demographics that either overlapped or completely matched what he was doing. Not that he knew any lesbian blacksmiths, but you know what I mean. Because, and it wasn't just that, it was also from a very specific socioeconomic background, from a very specific religious upbringing. This was something he could speak to with a little bit more authority, because he knew a lot of people who had been raised in the sort of environment that he had this character be raised in. And also he grew up in the Bible Belt, so he had kind of been exposed to it all of his life. He, however, had not been exposed to all of the other demographic considerations of his character. So he had sensitivity readers, although at the time we didn't know that was a term, right? Sensitivity readers wasn't a term, but he knew enough to make sure that it would read well when it was read by anybody who matched or overlapped with any of the demographics of any of his characters, because he had lots of characters from lots of different demographics. So this was what he wrestled with when he was putting together his novel, and then he turns it in. He finds an agent, because it's easier to find an agent when you have a book deal, and then you let the agent negotiate the terms of the deal rather than you signing away all of your licensing rights without knowing what you're doing, right? So when you're offered a deal, you find a competent agent to negotiate the details. But the agent that he had found was an agent who also likes to be involved in the crafting process. So he went through a round of revisions. Actually, there was a round of revisions with the agent, but then the real revisions came with the editor. And I, as somebody who had read both the first draft and the last, wow, what a huge difference editors make. This is part of the problem with self-publishing, is that if the authors who are being self-published, or who are publishing themselves their own works, if they do not either have an absolutely brilliant sense of being able to edit themselves, or if they don't hire somebody else to edit the manuscript is not going to be as good as it could be otherwise. And this is an opinion that is formed on a lot of experience, having read a lot of first drafts and having seen a lot of what a competent editor can do to bring the best writing out of the author. Still needs to be written by the author, but the editor is able to pull your best work out of you if the editor is good. His editor was fantastic. And those 3 books for that deal were absolutely top notch, very well done. And I want to tell you one key story that to this day touches me deeply. He had received an email from a teacher, and this was a high school teacher in Canada, who had written to him about a student in the teacher's class in Canada, and then passed along the information so that the student could write to John. But it was essentially this student, and it's the student's email that, man, it just hit so hard. She was a student in high school. She was struggling with her own sexual orientation and feeling like an outsider, and just and having struggles with her parents, with her home life, with the roles she's supposed to play versus the roles that she feels she can play. And she was having a real crisis of self when the teacher had recommended that she read this book. The book was in his classroom library because the book had won a librarian's award, which is just amazing. And it had also won a couple of awards for representation within the LGBTQ community. And she read this book and she said, she said these words, "It saved my life." And I was very fortunate to hear John read me this letter out loud. And John, if you can ever get a letter like that, where somebody says to you, "Thank you for seeing me. You saved my life. You gave me a reason to believe that I matter." I cannot think of any higher praise for your work than that. We as writers try to touch people, to connect with them, and in turn connect with our greater understanding of humanity. And he did receive other letters later on, and again, I remember he heard specifically from this teacher because the teacher saw the power of this one novel with this one student, and then he very strongly advocated for this book to any of his fellow high school English teachers who would listen. And here's a thing I will say is that there are a lot of people who argue that certain books shouldn't be on the shelves of schools, school libraries, and I will say this. Intelligent minds can argue about when and where certain books should be made available, but by the time you get to high school, if somebody is reading, they should be able to read really any any books that are uh, any good books. I can't even put any other qualifiers on it. A well-written book. You may not agree with all the many different ways people express themselves or feel their identity is expressed, and it doesn't matter because other people believe different things, other people feel different things, and if a book connects someone else to humanity, someone else to the greater human community, the fact that you don't like that book is irrelevant and counterproductive. Anyway, this is me on my soapbox, and the whole point of this editorial here is not to get on my soapbox about banning books. But banning books was indeed a topic that had come up, and in particular because some people thought he shouldn't have written the book because it's an affront to the people he was writing about, and other people thought he shouldn't write the book because it offended their sensibilities of those people shouldn't even exist, and he did what he felt was right, and what he did saved at least one life, and as far as I'm aware, saved more. When I say as far as I'm aware, I am aware that there were other letters from other students as well. But that was the one that he had read to me, and it was just, man, I cannot think of any higher praise than for a reader to say that you affected me this much, that you helped me to connect with meaning in my life. So anyway, when he shared that with me, I just felt so much joy for him, for the connection, for all of it. So yeah, so this is my author friend John, and at some point when we were sharing this office, I told him the story of Dr. Henry Tooney. He's dead now, poor bastard. And John appreciated the humor of the situation. And this became particularly relevant when he started about 7 years ago to experience some symptoms that his doctor wrote off as, well, it's probably just acid reflux. It's probably just GERD. GERD. I don't even remember what that stands for. But what I do remember was this doctor was just writing it off as it's this or it's that, and the doctor wasn't taking him seriously. And the doctor would say, "Well, you need to lose weight." Now, the thing about John is he was about 6'4". He was a tall dude, and yeah, he was a little overweight, but he was also a very, very tall, big dude. You would never look at him and think he was fat, but nonetheless, according to the charts and stats and all the rest of that, yeah, the doctor was right. He could afford to lose weight, so he did. And the doctor still would end up postponing, canceling appointments that had been made a couple months in advance. So now John had to wait another couple of months. Anyway, it was a series of very unfortunate events that ultimately led to, oh, no, you actually have a very, very serious heart problem. And now it's too late to do anything about it because it has progressed as far as it has. So, yeah, it was about, from what I am aware, it was about 6 months from the symptoms starting to become so pronounced that he had to start taking them seriously and going to see medical help, to when he shuffled off his mortal coil. And before, in fact, I would say for the last several months, there was a call for submissions that we both had received for stories about the Space Force. Now this was back when, during the first administration of Donald Trump, uh, Donald Trump had announced the creation of a new branch of the military called Space Force. And a lot of people chuckled and shuffled, shrugged it off, but it was a thing. And in fact, it turns out, remember talking about Dr. Henry Tooney and the two friends of mine who had taken classes with him. Well, one of them is at the forefront of the space force, actually, like from its before its inception. It was something that he was even working on when we were grad students in political science, because this was something that was very much on his mind as being something that we had to pay attention to in the future. And I have no idea how instrumental he was in bringing it about, but he was one of the professors at the military academies who did help to shape the idea of how this works, how it would work, how it should work, what strategy would look like, and that kind of thing. So it's interesting to kind of see that topic from both ends. So on the one hand, there's a friend of mine from grad school who was advocating for this, and on the other hand, there's a president who, when he first announces this, a lot of people kind of laugh it off, and then we have our editor friend who had already published a couple of anthologies of short stories that were essentially taking the worst elements of the presidential administration and following them to their illogical final conclusions. There's a Latin term for that, reductio ad absurdum, I think, where essentially you follow this one obnoxious idea to its obviously ridiculous endpoint. One of these anthologies was called Alternative Truths, after a comment that had been made by one of the representatives for the administration, and where she referred to lies that were being, or sorry, misstatements, statements of things that were not in fact real. She referred to them as, well, as alternative facts. Well, these people have these facts and these people have alternative facts. Well, whatever. So anyway, the editor had put out a couple of anthologies that were very much a repudiation of this anti-intellectual sentiment that was running through the administration. And now this editor was going to be doing an anthology on Space Force. And he put out the call. John and I had been in a critique group together some years prior, and one of the stories that he had run through the critique group never did find a home. Typically, what will happen with a writer is you write what you want to write because you want to write it, but then you look for a market for it. If what you wrote is science fiction, you send it to the editors of the science fiction publications and anthologies and all that, and you hope that somebody likes it enough for their publication. This one didn't find a home until this editor said, I'm looking for stories about the Space Force. And keep in mind, so the idea is science fiction stories that kind of follow things to their absurd conclusions. And what John did was, he and I talked about it. He's like, I think I'm going to take this one story that you've read. And I'm like, oh yeah, I've read that one. That was a pretty decent story. He's like, yeah, I'm just going to file off the serial numbers instead of making it about some other federation out there or whatever. Just make it about Earth. And, this is an Earth spaceship and they are part of Space Force. And I'm like, sounds good to me. So he did that. He rewrote it. He submitted it to the editor. Now, the thing about the editor is he very much loves John's writing. And he made a point of saying to John, I definitely want you to submit something. So when John submitted something, the thing about the editor is he's like waiting for a bunch of stories to accumulate and then he's going to read them all at once. Except when John sent in his story, he went ahead, he read it right away, and he loved it and he bought it. And he said, John, I'm buying your story. And so John was the first story to be secured for this anthology. And John said to me, Inris, you have to write for this anthology. You have to do it. You haven't been writing for a while. You need to get another story out there. And yeah, but I mean, I don't have anything that's just sitting around waiting for me to file the serial numbers. I'd have to write something new. And he's like, then write something new. Yeah, I know. And I was very much at a point in my life at this particular time to where I was working. I was a single parent of many children, and it was a bit of a uh, I was just allowing myself to be overwhelmed. And when I say allowing myself, that sounds a little harsh. There was a lot going on, and nonetheless, I could have eked out some time to do some writing. I just didn't feel as compelled to write at that point in my life as other times in my life when I can't help it. I have to write. I have to tell stories. At that particular point in my life, I didn't feel that driving compulsion. He did. And he very much believed in my writing, and he believed in my talent. He believed in me as a person. He was frequently trying to encourage me in any number of matters, including the writing. And I kept saying, yeah, I know I should. And then I didn't. And then John's health started to deteriorate. Now, usually when a call for submissions to an anthology is sent out, there's a time limit. And the time limit is usually something, it could be a couple of months, it could be 6 months. But when the focus became taking care of work, taking care of my life's business, but also my friend here is experiencing some health concerns, so that took up some mental headspace. It's kind of redundant saying mental headspace. Let's just say headspace. So I didn't write, and his health continued to get worse. And then it got a lot worse. And then he knew that things were going very, very sideways before he started telling other people. And so by the time he did tell other people, to use the term from the famous MCU movies, he was in the end game, and so he was trying to put his affairs in order, and I was, and I kept wanting to connect with him as a friend, as a person, and he kept wanting to connect with me as a coworker, which at the time, I don't know, I felt a little weird about it. I understand, though, it has to do with his personality. He didn't want to leave his teammates in the lurch. And I was the only other programmer on the project who knew what he was doing with regard to this particular project. So on those few occasions that we were able to talk toward the end, he wanted to talk about how I needed to do things so that I could keep the project moving forward and support the teammates who were our ostensible customers. And which kind of made me feel for a little while like maybe I was more of a coworker than a friend. And that's on me. Later on, when I had conversations with other people after he had passed, people who I thought he clearly must have been closer to these people, what the others would say was that clearly Inris, he was much closer to you than he was to us, and I always sort of was a little envious of the fact that the two of you were so close, and meanwhile I'm thinking, no, the two of you were so close. And the more people I spoke with about this, the more I realized this was actually a common thread, that everybody felt like he had reached out, had helped them, had encouraged them, had provided them with resources and incentives to be their best selves, but that they never really had an opportunity uh, to like get on the inside, to be a part of the inner circle. And I knew I was somebody he spent far more time with than many others, but I also knew that there were others he spent even more time with than he did with me. And that's how everybody felt. Everybody who was close to him felt that there were other people who were getting more of him, and that's just because he gave so much of himself to so many people that I don't know. I guess it was just sort of one of those things where you realize at the end that as much as he gave and as much as you tried to give to him, that maybe it didn't quite tie up. That you didn't get to know him as well as you might have gotten to know some of your other close friends, and I think that's really what it comes down to. As encouraging as he was to me, and as much as I think he knew me, and as much as I think I knew him, uh, yeah, there was a very much a pronounced closeness, and at the same time a little bit of a wedge of distance, and that was just his personality. And it was an interesting thing to recognize later on. The friend of his, who was another author, a well published author, he's also somebody who writes and sings, and has recorded some of his own music, which, by the way, this friend and I both separately have been in have written our own music and performed it and recorded it and all the rest of that. John preferred heavy metal. He would prefer and especially old school heavy metal. And it was so funny to know that he would put up with listening to the other friend's music or my music, but he wasn't a real fan of any of that music. So why is he wasting his time doing this folk music? He should be writing. His writing is so much more important, and which I think is absolutely hilarious. And after John passed, both this other friend and I each wrote very, very different songs about the experience and about our friend. And it was neat to be able to share the songs with each other at an occasion where we don't get together as often now because we don't have John to bring us together. But every once in a while we get together, and it was just kind of neat to hear the song that he had written and the song that I had written, and they were both very uplifting in their way, because John was very uplifting. Okay, but I told you all that to tell you this. John passed away, and then it occurred to me, I haven't heard anything more about that anthology that he had sold his last story to. But I think the call for submissions is still open, and if it is, I want to share it with him. I feel like I need to be in there with him because I was there at the beginning, and because he was really, really encouraging me to join him in that table of contents. So I reached out to the editor, and he said, yeah, he hasn't closed that one yet. He's waiting for more manuscripts, and sure, go ahead and write something up and send it in. As I say, I didn't have something already ready. And I didn't really have a premise or anything like that. So I don't know. I kicked around the idea for a couple of months and I still didn't have the slightest clue. But a couple months down the road, we were going to be having this writer's retreat that where both the editor and I were going to go. And this was a retreat that John and I used to go to. We used to carpool together. And so I felt like I had to go. We were going to be, not only that, uh, John's wife made a paper mache Viking ship out of pieces of manuscript and first drafts and rough drafts and final drafts of John's writing. So she used that paper to make a paper mache Viking ship. And then the idea was at this writer's retreat to bring the Viking ship, and then we would push it off into Lake Quinault and set it on fire like a true Viking burial should be. And it was just a fantastic idea. The event did happen, by the way, but that was one of the reasons why I felt like I had to go, even though I really didn't feel like going. But I had to go for that to support John's widow and his family. His son was going to be there, and I don't remember. His daughter might have been there too. I think she was, but so many friends and all the rest of that. But aside from that, the editor was going to be there, and the editor had encouraged me to get something in there into the anthology. And John had encouraged me to get something into the anthology, and I felt like this was the last request of his that I could possibly fulfill. I need to do something. And after a couple of months of coming up with nothing, I finally just forced myself to sit down, come up with some ideas, and then start writing no matter what. And there's this idea of trust the process. All right, I've got a couple of characters, I've got a setting. I know how this is going to kick off, and the thing is, my favorite novel, one of my favorite novels that I've read this one at least 6 times, Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. Catch-22 is a satire, and I decided, since I was writing a military story in an anthology that is supposed to be following silly ideas to their illogical conclusion, I should write a satire. And I was writing inspired by the style of Joseph Heller. I was not trying to mimic. You cannot mimic Joseph Heller, nor would I ever want to. I have my own comedic style. I used to host a radio comedy show. You just develop your own sense of timing by listening to other people's sense of timing. So I decided I was going to write this farce, and I know what the very opening scene is going to be, and it's going to be a space mechanic who has to change a sign in the Mars orbiter station because the Earth government keeps changing its mind as to what the name of the orbiter should be. So that's the premise, because the administration at that time was in the process of renaming everything. So I thought that would be funny. So that was the starting premise. And then I got to the end and I'm like, well, I don't know how this story is going to go, but I do know what the next scene is. At the end of this scene, my main character gets injured. And so in the next scene, we're going to see what happens with my character at the infirmary. And then in the meantime, I have a couple of other characters who I'd introduced. One obliquely, don't let Hadley touch the gravity drive. I can't even remember if that's what I named the character, but there was an ad for printers where, the network is down again, the printers aren't working. Hadley was working on it. Hadley. So anyway, just this idea of everybody in unison saying Hadley. This character who was mentioned obliquely just as a, yeah, we can't let that guy touch the gravity mechanisms. But then there was also a character who was the dispatcher who was talking to our protagonist. So while that character isn't yet on camera, as it were, we are hearing that character's voice because they're talking via intercom. So that character, the thing about all of the characters in this story is their names are all meant to convey something very specific. And in the case of the grunts of the Space Force, their names convey the exact opposite of what they are. So if my main character is named Blondie, of course he's bald. And if our dispatcher is named Tiny, of course he's large. Someone had even once referred to John as having the hair of a Greek god. And so I gave him that exact description in the short story. I referred to Tiny having the hair of a Greek god. That was fun. And the more I got into it, actually, the more fun it was to write. And at some point I realized, as again, each scene suggested what the next scene was going to be. And then I realized after I was, I don't know, maybe 2,500 words into the story, and usually I wrote stories that were about 3,500 words. By the way, writers don't don't count pages, they count words. That's just a thing, because you could change the point size to make your words take up more pages or fewer pages, but the word count is what ultimately matters. My typical short story length would be 3,500 words. As a general rule, you want to shoot for something between that, maybe 5,000 words. So my short stories tended to come in on the short side of the range, but they were always within the range. And I was at about 2,500 words, and I figured, well, I've only got to put together another 1,000 words, and I think I know where this is going to go. And so I sat down, and it was on a weekend or something. I didn't have the kids that weekend, and I just started typing and kept typing and typing and typing and typing until maybe a day and a half later, I had a 7,500 word short story. 7,500 words is too long for an anthology because that could take up the space of 2 regular-sized short stories. 7,500 words is still a short story. It's just a very long short story. You have to get a little bit longer before you get into novelette territory, and then you have to get longer still to get into novella territory, which, of course, then after that you have novels. It's harder to sell stories that are in the in-between range. So this was too short for a novelette, and it was too long for a short story. I submitted it anyway. And then I'm looking at the time here. I've been telling this story for a little while now. So I submitted the story, and then at some point in the Facebook group, the editor said, hey, the editor said that on Facebook, to the Facebook group of authors who had sold to him, and I had sold a story to him previously. He said, hey, I have finally finalized the table of contents for Space Force. I will be sending out acceptances and rejections forthwith. And then I didn't hear anything. And then later on, he said, it's a few days later, oh, I have sent out some more acceptances and rejections. And then I have sent out all of the rejections. And I'm like, oh, I guess that means he's going to accept my story because I still haven't heard anything. And then he said, I have sent out all of the acceptances. So now everybody has the information. And I'm like, but I don't have any information. I haven't heard anything. Well, the editor was going to be at the writer's retreat, so I figured I would talk with him about it then. Show up at the retreat, talked to him, said, "Hey, I haven't heard anything, and I'm just kind of curious as to. I fully expected he had just rejected my story. I was kind of sad at that prospect, but I also, it's 7,500 words. Of course, it's too long. I completely understand that." And he said, no, I should have. I know I read your story. I have to have read your story. And I must have accepted it. Let me look through. And he had his laptop with him. We're meeting in the lounge. It's a tavern in the area, the resort where we're having our retreat. We get really good rates if you go in February, because the area is dead in February on the peninsula of the Washington coast. Well, I don't see it in my chart of stories. Let me look in my email boxes. And he looks for the accepted mailbox and then the rejected mailbox, and he's like, "I can't find your email anyway." But you're certain you yeah, I'm absolutely certain I submitted it. Okay, well, let me see. And then he says, "Oh, here it is. I appear to have mislabeled it in my email system. I haven't read it yet. I suppose I should just go ahead and read it now." And I'm like, "Oh, okay." And I figured, well, this is great. He's gonna read it over during this retreat, and I'll know by the end of the retreat whether or not he's gonna buy it. That'll be great. There's still a shot. And then he said, "Yeah, I tell you what, I'm just gonna sit here at the bar and I'll just read it right now." Well, now I'm like, wait a minute, I don't want to be hovering around the editor while he's reading my story. That just feels sort of icky. Watching somebody as they're reading your story, and especially when it's an editor, I know I don't like it when people are reading over my shoulder or waiting for me to do something and they're hovering behind me. And so I said, "Well, go to my cabin and we could talk about it later." He's like, "No, I'll read it right now. Why don't you just stay here, whatever." So I ended up sitting at the table behind him, and then somebody comes up to chat with him. And now he's chatting with that guy. And then that person leaves, and then he gets back to his computer. And then somebody else comes up to chat with him. And then he's chatting with that woman, and then she leaves, and then he's looking at the story again. And I'm thinking to myself, this is not how I want him to read my story, because if he can't focus on my story, nothing's going to sink in, and he's just going to be whatever. And this is terrible. This is the worst. And then somebody else comes up and he's talking to that person, and then he orders another drink, and then he's looking at the story, but then I hear him chuckle. Ooh, that's not bad. And that's cool. All right, he chuckled. And then at some point, after much commotion and interruptions and all the rest of that, he kind of waves me over, and I go over there, and he said, "I like it. I'm gonna buy it." And I'm like, "Yay, great, thanks. I'm really glad to hear that." And then I told him, I'm glad to hear that, because I really want to be. Not only because you're always glad to sell your story, but I really wanted to share John's last table of contents. And he's like, and just the look, he really understood. He deeply missed John. He just, as I say, he really appreciated John, and he particularly appreciated his writing. And he said, "Yeah, no, I totally get that." And he's like, "Well, it's 7,500 words. That's kind of long." And I'd sort of set a limit of 120,000 words for the book. And what am I saying? I'm the editor. I'm the one who decides whether it goes in, and it's going in. And I'm like, all right, works for me. Later on, I got an email with the contract and with the with his proposed changes. And usually an editor will say, restructure this, tighten this up, can you add motivation for whatever? You'll get those sorts of notes as a general rule. And that's what happened in this case. It was actually very, very brief. He said, look, it's a little bit long. You're going to have to put it on a diet. And you're going to have to decide where to cut, but I think you can cut this particular subplot. And I think, and that's about it. Whatever you do, don't touch the infirmary scene, because that is money. The scene that takes place in the infirmary is absolutely a farce about all of the paperwork you have to fill out when you're in a hospital setting. And his comments were, that is just so military. That is exactly how the military works. It's just one dumb piece of documentation after another. And I was rather happy to hear that, because he served in the military. He knew what he was talking about. And for my story to ring true for somebody who has actually served in the military, this might be cultural appropriation because I've never served in the military. So I am borrowing that. I'm not borrowing glory, I'll tell you that, but certainly borrowing something. But for him to say that I captured that idea really kind of tickled me. But then I had to remove this subplot because I couldn't figure out what else to cut. I really didn't want to cut the subplot that he wanted me to cut, because I thought it was very, very important to the point I was trying to make. However, he thought he took it only at the surface level. He didn't see the metaphor. And well, if I can't get him to see the metaphor, I don't know that I'm going to get any of the anthology readers to get the metaphor, so I guess it may as well come out anyway. I yanked it out. That was 1,000 words. And then I had to spackle the holes that it left when I yanked it out, and that put in another 500 words. So in the end, I got it down to, I don't know, 6,500, maybe 7,000 words. It's still too long. But I did what I could, tightened it up, where I could, sent it in, and he just went ahead and accepted it, and then I had the contract and signed it and sent it in, and then it appeared in the book. So when the book came out, I didn't know that this was going to happen. And by the way, after you send in the story, and then he says, okay, now I need you to send in a bio, roughly this many words. I think this one might have been 500 words or something like that, up to 500 words. I really wanted to say it was important for me to share John's last table of contents, because we had shared his first table of contents, but I chose not to. I think I made the wrong call, but I just made the bio really, really short and very businesslike, because I didn't want to, I don't know, I think I didn't want to draw too much attention to I wrote this satirical farce, and I didn't want to tie it to something that could be kind of heavy. But then when I got the galleys, the opening editorial was written by our mutual friend, the other writer, the one who wrote a song for him. And it is just so touching. And the whole book is dedicated to John, which is heartwarming in such a profound way. I probably still could have updated my bio at that stage, but again, I felt like this is about John. It's not about me. I'm just gonna let it go as it is. That said, the book is out, and I'm sharing a table of contents with him. But here's the thing about the story. In the story, Hadley, or whatever name I gave that character, ends up not surviving the events of the story. And every time characters in the story, now keep in mind, they're all part of the Space Force. They're all people who have served together, and they have their traditions and all that. Whenever anybody refers to somebody who has passed away, everybody says in unison, after that person has been referenced, they say, "Poor bastard." And I put that in there. First of all, if you establish that that's a pattern, now you've established that there's a tradition. These people share a history. Even if you don't say what the history is in the story, you feel the characters are more real because they have a life outside of the story. So there's that. I think it's important to include that sort of shared language that characters would have with each other. But beyond the shared language that they all have with each other, it's a shared language that I also shared with John. And it was important to me to include pieces of John throughout the story, in addition to the fact that there's a character who has his physical attributes and who also has his sensibilities and all the rest of that. I mean, John isn't in the story, but there's a character who represents the best that I could capture of John. But just that idea of the shared joke, especially around mortality, around acknowledging the mortality and acknowledging that it sucks, and all of these other things are also true. So yeah, Hadley shouldn't have been working on the gravity devices, and he didn't survive the process, and that sucks. And at the same time, we're here, and life goes on, and we continue with that woven into the fabric. I think that's ultimately what I'm trying to convey. And so I'm not even scratching the surface of all the stories I could tell about John, but I did want to tell you about John. I'm obviously telling you more about John, more than just John. It's about my relationship with John and John's relationship with other people and the impact that John has had on people. And he did, in the end, after the end of his 3-book deal, the company didn't get quite as much money out of it as they had hoped. The first book did very, very well, but they did not promote the second book. And so as a result, they chose not to extend the contract after the third book came out. And so he did end up having the fourth book published through a different outlet. And that did go through an editorial review, even though it wasn't as big a publishing house as the one he had started with. And he had finished the fifth book, and the fifth book was actually on its way to publication. I think it might have come out just before he died, but either way, there's 5 books of that series that are out. I know what his plans were for the last 2, and I don't think they're ever going to get written because no arrangements were ever made for somebody to take over the series. Even so, the books are self-contained and they tell a great story. And so if you ever have a chance to, if you're ever in the mood to read urban fantasy about Norse mythological gods and semi-gods and demigods living amongst us, and as well Ren fairs and LARPers and blacksmiths and people who are struggling with their identity and all that stuff. It's really, really just a fun series to read. It is about good versus evil. It is about coming to terms with who you are and your role in the great big mishmash of things, and it's fun stuff. So anyway, I recommend the Black Blade Blues series of books by J.A. Pitts, and yeah, and anyway, that's my story for today. Thanks for checking in on another entry of the Inris Files. Until next time, keep your mind open and your thinking sharp. Take care.